Hi, my name is Rob Eshman. I'm the national editor of The Forward, and I'm so happy you could join us today for Animal Vegetable Junk, a conversation on food, climate change, and spirituality with Mark Bittman and Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, sponsored by The Forward and Dayenu. It's a difficult time, and I know that there's a lot going on in the world, but so much, as we know, depends on food, not least of which our lives, our health, the health of the planet. And our guests have devoted their lives to exploring these connections. And I'm so honored they'll be joining us today. I'll make the introductions. We'll talk. If you have questions, please put them in the chat below, and I'll do the introductions. So, Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, so happy to have you with us today. Rabbi Rosenn is the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action, which seeks to mobilize the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis. Along with 25 years of leadership in the nonprofit sector, she's also served as rabbi at Columbia University. Mark Bittman is someone personally I have read and admired for years, and I know you get that a lot. Like so many people, I keep Mark's best-selling cookbook, How to Cook Everything, very close to me. He was over 3 decades, right, at the New York Times, where he pioneered writing about food issues as an editorial columnist. And he most recently is the author of Animal Vegetable Junk. And I want to say that if you haven't read it yet, don't think that this talk is a substitute for going out and reading this book. It is a vital book. I want you to read it. I want you to share it with people. We all need to do that. So Mark and Jennie, welcome.
Thank you, Rob.
So Mark, your book flows from this radical question, what is food for? That you asked at the beginning of the book. I did read the book. Read, highlighted, the whole thing. So this is a seemingly very obvious question, what is food for? But as you write in the book, it's the answer, we've come up with the wrong answer this whole time. So I want you to talk a little bit about why that question and what flows from the fact that we've answered it wrong.
I mean, so what is food for? The answer is obvious. It's to feed people. And then you could build on that, feed people nutritionally, feed people affordably, maybe minimize impact to the environment and other species, do it well, and so on. And yet, the real answer, the answer of the age that we're living in, the answer of the last 500 years, is it's to make money. It's grown to make money. We grow food to make money. 75 years ago, 100 years ago, everybody knew a farmer or was a farmer and understood where food came from and what it was about. Now we're alienated from it. We're divorced from it. We have very little control over how it's grown, how it's processed, or even what it is. And if you look at the order of priorities of the people who produce food, the first priority is to make money. The second priority is to make money for landholders. And the third and distant priority is to feed people. And it can't endure. That doesn't work.
One of the myths one of the, I guess, truths that you challenge in the book is that this idea that the Green Revolution, that agriculture itself, and then the Green Revolution that we grew up believing was going to feed the world and going to make food accessible to all, has had these terrible costs on our health and on the earth. You want to talk about that a little bit, what some of these costs are?
Well, the Green Revolution is just part of the expansion of the American style of agriculture and eating, which began around the time of World War I and really accelerated after the end of World War II. When, the 20th century was the American century because the United States dominated the agricultural world, the economic world, the political world, the military world, the industrial world. That's no longer the case, but we have certainly, we do continue to dominate in many spheres. And one of those spheres is the exportation of American agriculture, which is what the Green Revolution was. The Green Revolution started as an okay idea. I think that its originators had good intentions, but it quickly became a PR plan or a marketing plan for big industrial agriculture, a way to sell more tractors, to sell more chemicals, to sell more seeds, which are the sort of big three. And I mean, here I mean hybridized patented seeds, the big three cornerstones of industrial agriculture. To the extent that American and now multinational companies can sell their products globally, they do well and they make money. That doesn't mean that they're helping people feed themselves. In fact, they're doing quite the opposite. Pesticides, as we know, are carcinogenic, and the suffix "side" means kill. So they are designed to kill, and they are broad spectrum and always kill more than their intended targets. Hybridized seeds have some advantages, but they have disadvantages too. They're expensive. They're not usually tailored to their local environment. They can't be passed on from one season to the next. And machinery is great, but it increasingly was designed to farm bigger and bigger plots. And so the machinery and the size of the agricultural plots grew together, and that the combination of those things, chemicals, hybridized seeds, and machinery, leads to a kind of agriculture we call industrial agriculture. It can be more specifically described as monoculture, that is the growing of one crop on one big plot of land per season. And that decreases biodiversity, it decreases soil health, it increases soil loss, it mandates the use of chemicals that are bad for the soil, bad for the air, bad for the water and our health, and so on. I mean, all of this, as you said, it's detailed more in the book, but much of this is common knowledge. The real question, I mean, the book answers the question how we got here. The real question for right now is how do we move forward?
Talk a little bit about, I grew up in the 60s and 70s when I was told that all those things you said, they were great because they were going to feed this growing population. And without them, you couldn't just have, me in my garden growing tomatoes. It wasn't going to feed the world. And one of the upshots of that was they created this agriculture, modern agriculture created what you call highly processed foods.
Ultra processed.
Yeah. Sorry, you missed the adjective. Ultra processed foods, which again, I grew up believing were great for you because they were packed with vitamins and they were created by scientists in laboratories. So how could they? And they were advertised to me by people who, how could they be wrong, right? So tell me about the impact of what are ultra processed foods and why are they killing us?
Well, I do want to say first, just 3 or 4 good points to be made here, I think. But I do want to say first that it isn't our job to feed the world. And when industrial ag says we're going to feed the world, basically it's back to that thing I said before. It means we're going to conquer the world. People have a right to decide how they're going to eat, how they grow their own food, who owns their land, and so on. American agriculture should not be the determinant of that. There's a line to get to the ultra processed food thing, which is synonymous with junk. There's a line in the book where I call white bread a vitamin pill in the form of sponge cake. And I actually think that's a pretty good line. I'm very proud of it.
I think that's kind of mean. It's kind of mean to sponge cake.
But I grew up obviously the same time. And, when they were saying Wonder Bread helps build bodies, strong bodies 12 ways, and the 12 ways that it helps build strong bodies are all chemical vitamin additions. The bread itself is bad for you. So we stripped out, not we, thankfully, or we'd be guilty about this, but the food system stripped the nutrients out of some of the best foods that nature has to offer us. And then recognizing that there were negative consequences to removing all of this vital stuff from our food, they started to put it back in the form of chemicals. And that continues to this day. If you say, well, breakfast cereal is devoid of fiber, then the breakfast cereal manufacturers will simply put fiber into the breakfast, rather than make the breakfast cereal a good product, they will put fiber into a bad product. If you say, we saw this with low fat, we've seen this with sugar, rather than us not being fed foods that are highly sweetened, we're now fed foods that are sweetened with artificial sweeteners. There's still plenty of sugar and corn syrup, of course. So all of this is bad from an agricultural perspective for some of the reasons I talked about before. The monoculture drove the dominance of corn and soybeans, and the presence of corn and soybeans as our major crop has driven the production of not only ethanol, but junk food and animal feed for industrially produced animals. But the other upshot is this public health crisis, where the leading killer in the United States, 1.8 million premature deaths every year, compared to 300,000 last year from COVID. The leading killer is chronic disease, and the leading driver of chronic disease is a bad diet, and the leading cause of a bad diet is ultra-processed food. So you have this sort of, it's a confluence of epidemics. You could call it a pandemic, only no one recognizes it. No one is an exaggeration. The powers that be refuse to recognize it as a crisis. And so we're kind of stuck with it until we gather our forces and start to force changes ourselves.
We're going to come back to some of those individual issues, but I think it's just important to keep in mind that everything you're saying flows from this idea that our food system was designed or thought of or conceived to create profit and not to actually nourish people, which is the point of food. And I think that's just such a fundamental point. I want to flow a little bit into our climate change discussion. And Jennie, I want you to talk a little bit about the parallels between the broken food system that Mark was describing and our energy and transportation systems, and how you see those in parallel working. What are the connections you see between those?
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be here with the Forward and with one of my food heroes. Like many people, you're usually in my kitchen, so it's wonderful to be with you face to face. So there are a remarkable number of parallels between our broken food system and our broken energy and transportation system. And this is where we see the convergence in many ways between the issues that Mark is talking about and the climate crisis. So I just want to name sort of four big ones. One is that in both cases, there's a small set of corporate actors, whether that's big ag or big oil or Wall Street investors, who have, as you've been talking about, these vested economic interests that are primarily responsible for delaying and denying the changes that we know need to happen. So these corporations, and of course the politicians who do their bidding, effectively reduce the choices that consumers can make about what we eat and how we move ourselves around the world and how we power our lives. So we don't have the choices that we, sometimes there's like a limitation to our choices that is built into the system, and also a way that we're being driven towards certain kinds of food and energy. Two, the impacts of both the climate change and bad food systems disproportionately fall on Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income communities and folks, even as the impacts spread far and wide, right? In this way, it's actually not unlike COVID. I think it's a helpful analogy in some ways, a painful one, that it affects everyone, but not everyone equally. So among other things, I think this means that as we're thinking about food systems and climate, we need to be sure to center the most impacted communities in the process and in the solutions that we're moving towards. And that's where you often will hear also about food justice and climate justice needing to be central. Three, and this is a hard one, I think this is about mitigating harm. I don't think we're past the point of avoiding climate change or avoiding the climate crisis in the same way that I think we're unlikely to end big ag anytime soon. But there is still, I think, tremendous hope to make things significantly less bad for us and for future generations. But I think this idea that we're going to, prevent is we're well past that point. And that's where I think we need to be holding both a kind of sense of urgency and a sense of possibility. And those are equally important. And then last, I don't think the change that's needed is going to come from guilting people into changing their personal behaviors. This is both because, and I think hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about this a little bit, I don't think that the scale of change that's needed can be reached just by individual choices. And secondly, I don't think people change through guilt and shame. I think that there is the need for a collective vision and collective action that's going to bring us to the kind of transformation that we need, but not through guilting or shaming people around their individual choices, whether that be energy, lifestyle, food. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say about all of this.
Well, first of all, if you don't think people change through guilt, then this isn't a very Jewish conversation.
We don't have a lot of guilt. We have a lot of guilt and a lot of shame.
I don't know how else to change people other than guilt. But Mark, could you talk a little bit about what Jennie touched on, some of the large scale drivers of the climate crisis, but could you talk particularly about ag's role in this crisis?
I will for a second, but I'd like to respond to a couple of the great things that Jennie, or reinforce a couple of the great things.
Go ahead.
But Rob, you need years of therapy to get over that guilt thing. So,
years more, you mean?
Years more. The really good, there's been obviously a ton of great work done on tobacco and on climate and on food and the deny, deflect, disavow, all these big Ds that corporate promoters of fossil fuel use and of big ag and of tobacco and big pharma and so on use when confronted with the truth. So that's one thing that Jennie said that was right on. The final, and then saying, of course, that we need to be increasingly led by people who suffered most from these things. I don't think you mentioned women, Jennie, but women were shut out of a lot of this stuff also. But really, it was the third and fourth points. The third and fourth points that make the most sense. The fourth point was that it's not about behavior change. And the public health community went through a long period of making the mistake of thinking that we had to convince people to eat better, and if we could just educate people and tell them how to eat better, that would fix things. But it hasn't, because there's really not the kind of choice for most people that we imagine that there is. There's the economic issues, of course, and those are really important. But my favorite statistic from my book is that 60% of calories available today are ultra-processed foods. So again, we have parallels to transportation. It's like, well, cars are destroying the atmosphere. That's obviously shorthand, but let's say cars are destroying the atmosphere. Therefore, we should drive fewer cars, and yet you can't get to work if you don't have a car. So ultra-processed foods are bad for our health and bad for the environment and so on. So we should stop eating ultra-processed foods, yet 60% of the calories in the market are ultra-processed foods, which either means some combination of 100% of us get 60% of our calories from ultra-processed foods, or 60% of us get 100% of our calories from ultra-processed food, or some combination. So the behavior change thing is a factor, but it's not the determining factor. Supply or policy is really the determining factor. But I think, and it's going to be ridiculous if I'm the person who shifts this conversation to morality, but I'm sort of a new man. So I think that the part of what Jennie said that I really relate to increasingly is that we have to work for the future, and we may not get to see the results of that. And it's not selfless, because you can feel good about that, but there's no guarantee that the work that you do is going to yield good results in your lifetime, because we live for such a relatively short period of time, but the arc of history is really long. And so think, oh, well, if I want my grandchildren to live in a better place, or everybody's grandchildren to live in a better place, even if I want people who are 40, 50 years younger than me now to live in a better place, it's incumbent upon me to do that work, even if I'm not going to benefit directly from it. And that's, a lot of these conversations are, how do we change things? And yeah, it's important to vision how we change things, and it's important to work towards how we change things. But, in the 60s and early 70s, we thought we were making the revolution. And some of us did anyway. And we didn't make the revolution. And yet we made some changes, and we sowed the seeds for further changes. And the pendulum swings one way and it swings another. But I just think that it's really important to recognize that change is usually a slow process. It's inevitable. It's our jobs to guide it in the direction that we see is the right direction.
I mean, I really do think that takes the conversation in the direction of faith, because that's the essence of faith, to think that things will be different than they are now, or better than they are now. You do write in your book, so this isn't a new conversion, because in your book you compared this to movements for social change or economic justice, that those things take generations, and maybe this is that kind of a thing that could take quite a while. And I wonder also, when you think
even tobacco, which was so obviously
right,
poisonous, even that, the first articles linking tobacco and cancer appeared in the 30s. The Surgeon General report saying cigarette smoking causes cancer appeared in 64. The attorneys general won that case in 87 or 89. I can't remember which. So even that was 50 years, and it was an open and shut case. There was a smoking gun. Cigarette smoking causes cancer. Really, cigarettes should have been outlawed the day after that was discovered, but that took 50 years.
Jennie, you're saying, and this is where it's a little different than, say, a social justice movement, not that those aren't urgent, but Jennie, you're saying we don't have a lot of time to deal with climate change. We don't have time for people's, actions to catch up with their, with the experts. So how do you, so what do we do? What are the things we can do now?
Well, I think we're past the point where individual actions are going to get us there. And I think on the one hand, I agree with Mark, what you're saying about we're not going to see it all in our lifetime. I also think that it's a little bit different than other issues insofar as we have a pretty limited time window right now, right? If we're going to reach net zero emissions well before 2050, right, and build a just, equitable energy economy, which is sort of the North Star, what happens in these next 10 years is pretty make or break. So I think that's the tension in some ways, is that, of course, there's a sense of, this is about living l'dor vador. It's profoundly Jewish to feel like you're part of a chain of ancestors and generations, it's not just about this moment in history. And there is something about this particular issue that I think has a different kind of ticking clock, if you will, than most other issues. And so I think the challenge is, how do we actually galvanize the people power? Because this isn't, at the end of the day, we have the technology. We know, I mean, it's sort of what you're saying about tobacco, like we know the facts, we've known them for a long time. But there's not what we need now is really the political and collective will to bring about the kinds of transformation that's needed at the scale and speed that justice and science demand. So
so let's take it down to say one example. Mark, you write a lot in your book about CAFOs, the massive feeding scale. I think you said 10 billion animals a year are killed in the United States. When you said that number, I mean, I know, but that number is just so enormous. And all the things that flow from that, the animal waste, not, beyond the cruelty, the animal waste, the effect on our health, the antibiotics flowing into our system. And the impact, talk a little bit about the impact that you think this has on climate change. I know it's hotly debated, but then how do you see that changing quickly? Is it going to be impossible? Are we all going to start eating Impossible Burgers? I personally find them just to be another form of junk food.
Right, but they are another form of junk food. So let's put that aside unless you feel a need to talk about that. Well, Cory Booker has a good bill that he's trying to get to the floor of the Senate to limit the size of CAFOs and to limit the emissions of CAFOs. Really, in a way, there are a couple of moves that the Biden administration could make that would reduce the size and number of CAFOs and therefore the suffering of animals, as well as the environmental pollution. When it comes to climate change, I think the best estimate is that 10% of greenhouse gases are from industrial production of animals. And that's not carbon dioxide emissions. It's 10% because those are methane emissions. And methane is, 20% more power? 20 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of a greenhouse gas. So all of those things combine to make the way we produce and consume animals one of the fundamental problems of industrial agriculture. The EPA is supposed to be regulating CAFOs. It doesn't even know how many there are or where they all are. It thinks
you need to define CAFOs. A lot of people are asking.
CAFOs. Let's just say industrial production. Let's say factory farms. The definition is confined animal feeding operations, but let's just say factory farms or factory animal farming. Anyway, problematic. And as I said, both to you and in the book, it's problematic because we are the butchers of those animals. To the extent that we eat meat, we are complicit in raising 10 billion animals a year as if they were widgets. Calling a factory farm is accurate because the animals are treated as if they were interchangeable parts, and they are. And it becomes a moral issue, I believe, for all of us.
You talk in your book, speaking of moral issues, about how you said to Ezra Klein, one of the surprises in writing the book was finding myself feeling this kind of increased reverence for nature and having a little more understanding as a lifelong atheist and a failed Jew of the power of religion, or at least spiritualism. I really wanted you to, I was so taken by that. And I wanted you to expand on what in writing the book, was it looking into the CAFOs? What was it?
I just kept thinking, I have this friend who's way smarter than I am, and I've known all my life. And he's very into storytelling right now. Not that he's not into telling stories, he's into reading about storytelling and talking about storytelling. And it's just all of this, the wisdom of the ancients, as we would say, hasn't really changed. And things as corny as questions like, am I my brother's keeper, which by the way was the topic of my bar mitzvah sermon. I wouldn't say this anywhere else, but there you go. Or the golden rule, or any of that stuff is kind of what it comes down to. Like, are we going to treat the rest of the people in the world as our brothers and sisters, or are we not? And because there is a difference between the current age and earlier ages. One is that we threaten the entire planet with our actions. That's a big deal. No one did that before. The other is that we have the accumulated wisdom of 10 or 200,000 years, however you want to call it, and we can take advantage of that. So there's a way in which ignorance is no longer an excuse. If you believe in American exceptionalism or you believe in white supremacy, at this point, you are objectively on the wrong side of history. So we need to recognize that and act as if we can make the kind of change that brings us to the place where our kind of rhetoric, whether it's religious rhetoric or political rhetoric, says that we ought to be at. This is all actually achievable.
I think it's difficult with food, though, because at least we're taught, well, food is my choice. It's my business. It's none of your business what I put in my mouth. But what you're saying,
Guns too.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Guns too.
Guns too. But with food, that's universal. That you don't have a right to tell me what to eat, and yet what I eat, was what you're saying in the book, has these universal implications for the planet. So it becomes a social act.
Right, but what you eat is determined by what's grown, and what's grown is determined by policy. So you can change the policy and different food becomes available. And if we make better food universally affordable, available, accessible, then people eat better food. And they make choices, but this is the third time today I've said this, and I'm gonna go do it. I'm gonna go walk down the aisle of my local big supermarket with my phone, and I am gonna record what I see. And what I'm gonna see is aisle after aisle of food that's bad for you. And it passes for choice because there's 4 different kinds of orange soda, and you get to pick which one you want to poison yourself with. And that's repeated. That pattern is repeated 1,000 times in the supermarket. I mean, I think I'm going to reiterate that 60% thing. 60% of the calories available are ultra processed foods. That means you only have the choice, if you want to eat well, in the remaining 40% of calories, which means, again, something like 60% of the people in the country are going to be shut out if 40% are buying all the available good calories. And it is kind of like that.
And it's completely parallel to our energy and transportation systems, right? It's what you were saying, Mark, about cars. It's a rigged, if you will, it's a rigged system in some ways, being driven by big ag, big oil, corporate greed.
But Jenny, it's so interesting because Mark's original question of what is food for, you could say the same thing. What is transportation for? It's to get people to do the things they work and love and work. Mm-hmm. And yet, no, in America or in our modern society, transportation is for making a profit for the people who supply the cars and the oil. So a whole different set of things come out of that, and so it's so similar. I wonder if both of you think, the abolition movement started in the churches, civil rights movement started in the churches, synagogues, the refugee movement started in the churches, took place actually providing refuge in churches. And I wonder what you see the role, and some of the worst food you could eat is in churches and synagogues, right? In other words, you hear the rabbi's sermon and then you go to the kiddush and it's just junk food. And I've been in many churches and it's macaroni salad with processed. It's the same. So how do we get churches on? Jenny, you work a lot in this space. So how do we get churches on board? And Mark, how often do you speak to church leaders, church groups?
I want to just first say, as a rabbi, I need to go on record, because when I heard you speak with Ezra Klein, Mark, and say you were a failed Jew, I don't think there's such a thing. And I would even posit that there are ways that your work is deeply Jewish. I don't know you well enough to know if its roots come from there, but I just couldn't let that pass. So to answer your question, Rob, I think that communities of faith, it's not just about how do we get the churches on board, because the truth is, and certainly in the Jewish community, 80% of American Jews are concerned about the climate crisis. Most are not taking necessarily meaningful action around kind of systemic and structural change. And increasingly, this is true, in churches as well. I mean, we see the statistics. The evangelical church has a whole movement within it around the climate crisis. So I think the question might be sort of better asked or framed, like, what role do faith communities have in addressing the climate crisis? Because it's going to take all communities and all parts of society. And I think it's an ecosystem. Scientists have a role to play, educators have a role to play. I think faith communities have a role to play. We have 10 years to pull ourselves back from the brink and avoid the most devastating impacts, right? We're not going to avoid the whole thing. Can we avoid, it's almost like the Yom Kippur liturgy, right? Can we annul the severity of the decree? So if we have a chance of succeeding, we need all hands on deck. And this includes faith communities. So one of, I think, the most powerful roles is as a kind of moral call in our communities and to our political leaders. There's a moral and ethical line. Some of what Mark was just talking about in terms of the most fundamental values of how we treat other people who we see as our brothers and sisters. Industry's done a really good job, I think, at muddying the line. And part of the role of faith communities is to really lift up that call. We, created Dayenu to be part of mobilizing the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis together with other communities. We like to say with spiritual audacity and bold political action, and work in partnership with other faith climate groups, secular climate groups, Jewish organizations, right? One small part of a much bigger movement. So we need to be bringing sort of the full power of faith communities. I also think more generally, and this actually is related to the storytelling you were talking about, it's like, what are our national narratives? What are the solutions that are they rooted in the centrality of human dignity? Are they rooted in social justice? Are they rooted in the importance of the public good? And then there are two other pieces that I think in terms of the role of religious communities. One is that there's also, I think, a need for spiritually rooted activism. How do we bring our religious traditions and teachings and song and spirit, like what's going to sustain us in this work, and what can we call on? Going back to that question about ancestors and where we are in the arc of history. And then finally, I think beyond the organizing and the activism and the political action, how do we support people to confront the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual, for some the religious issues that are raised by this crisis? How do we support people to grapple with what it means to live and lead and parent kids who are coming of age in this time? How do we face the anxiety, the grief? I think one of the things that keeps people from really engaging, I think, is that it's just so freaking overwhelming to even imagine. Like, for me to imagine that my children and grandchildren might not have clean air to breathe and water to drink, and that my city might be underwater. So we turn away. And I think one of the roles for faith communities is to help people kind of face the truth. And I think there's an analogy here around food, right? I'm going back to that guilt and shame. Like, we all, it doesn't always feel great to make a certain food choice, right? But you sort of know on some level that certain things aren't as good for your body or your neshama, your soul, as other foods. And yet we make those choices. And how do we kind of sit with that discomfort and actually begin to face these realities? And I think doing that in the context of community, that this isn't a whole bunch of individuals, facing this, but that collectively we are in this and trying to envision, what do we want our society to be? What do we want our food systems to be? What do we want our transportation systems to be? How do we want our world to look?
Yeah.
And I don't know if we'll have a chance to talk about, sort of COVID and the pandemic, but I think that we're in a moment right now that is, I can't say unprecedented because it's just like the tritest thing to say, but there's something about this moment that is not just like the steady march of history. Like we're in a really pivotal, disruptive moment right now that is full of possibility. And we can, talk more about what that is. But I think that the role of faith communities is also about sustaining people in this work and giving people support to really face the hard truths of this moment we're in.
Mark, right. And I just, I ask about faith communities, Mark, and whether you've spoken to churches and church leaders, because in America, they have a lot of political power. The 30% of this country is evangelicals. You go into evangelical churches, they're not thinking about food, the ones I've been in. So how do you, do you see a movement coming out of the churches? Are you ever speaking to church groups?
I mean, a little bit. Really not much. Sometimes, but this has been an unusual book tour in that I haven't left home. So I'm saying yes to just about everybody who asks me to join them, but there aren't a lot of, it's not a coincidence that I'm Jewish and this is a Jewish-based conversation. Non-Jewish conversations are not inviting me to join for whatever reason, or that is non-Jewish spiritual conversations are not inviting me to join. Most stuff I do is secular. Almost all stuff I do is secular, actually.
Yeah. Let's talk about the COVID. I mean, COVID did kind of shift the ground. I mean, in good ways and bad ways. But one thing it did was show that food is actually essential, because a lot of us thought it was just ho-hos and ding-dongs. So do you see lasting changes or positive changes coming out of COVID, or more of the same, Mark?
I mean, what Jenny just said is exactly right. Is this a moment of opportunity or isn't it? I think we have to try to make it one. I think it's a window that's open a crack, and it's not a huge window. I think a lot is happening around politics that's really important, and I think our involvement is important. I think the fact that the administration is acknowledging that the climate crisis is a crisis and is acting on it is a good thing. But will anything actually happen? That's a tough question. I mean, people inevitably ask me what it is they can do, and the easy thing is to talk about people's diet, especially, again, since I tend to speak to people who have money. It's easy to say to people, well, eating well is not that big of a challenge. But then when you say, how do you change the food system? How do you address climate change? How do you address income inequality, gender discrimination, racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Those are things where laws and policies and regulations have to change. And I think one of the really important things right now is to make sure that the 2022 elections continue in the direction that the 2020 election went in, which is to say lots of people voting and increasing numbers of people voting for progressives. And, I hate that. I hate that that's true, but I do think that is true, is that a lot of energy needs to go into that kind of organizing and that kind of activity.
Is that because these issues like food has become so politicized, climate change has become so politicized, even though they're essentially scientific, fact-based conversations we should be having?
I don't know that they're politicized as much as they are controlled by people who don't have our best interests at heart. I mean, it goes back exactly to the food thing, the good food versus bad food thing, or the car versus public transportation thing. You can want to abandon your car, but if you have no other way to get to work, that's how you're getting to work. And You can want to abandon junk food, but if you're out and about and you're in a hurry, then the drive-through is the only thing that's available to you often.
I think that the pandemic also has, I think, taught us a few things, like viscerally, things that we knew intellectually, I think we now have an experience of. And the question is, can we build from that? So to state the obvious, that sense of being interconnected, and that what happens in other parts of the world relates to us, and what we do relates to other parts of the world, and that what happens with our neighbors and the share of collective health and the way in which we're all interconnected is something that we've all experienced in this past period in a profoundly different way. I also think that the knowledge of what disruption feels like what happens when government fails to prepare or respond adequately, what happens when we don't listen to science. We have a pretty profoundly devastating example that we're living through right now. And I also think that even for those of us who are comfortable, we have felt the fragility of our systems of infrastructure, of food and transportation and education and our energy systems. Like, we are experiencing the weakness of our infrastructure and lack of preparedness. I think food insecurity right now, is it 45 million people, 1 in 8 in the richest countries in the world, dealing with food insecurity. And on the other side, I think we've seen how quickly we can make massive societal change as a collective. I mean, certainly in my lifetime, there has been no other example of this. And it's not abstract. We're all living it. In some ways, it's even hard to talk about because we're still living it. And I think that this disruption and destruction, and also the economic fallout, has given us an opportunity. It's kind of an unexpected opportunity, but we have to rebuild. So are we going to bolster the same unjust economies and polluting infrastructure, or are we going to envision and rebuild something different? I also think we really can't talk about this time without also talking about the uprising for Black lives, which I think has really put into sharper relief the systemic racism that's pulsing through our nation. I think it's heightened our awareness of the insidiousness of white supremacy, and how Black, Brown, and Indigenous people bear the weight of injustice. And that's a force multiplier, right? That's a force multiplier when it comes to food systems. It's a force multiplier when it comes to the climate crisis, exacerbating historical inequities. And the sense, like the climate crisis, is going to affect everyone. It does already affect everyone, but not equally. And so I think it's that dual, no matter what color of your skin or your level of wealth, the climate crisis is a threat, and it doesn't affect us all equally. So I think all of these things have given us a deeper knowledge and experience. And the question is, can we take that and, are we all just going to go back to our little quarters and dig in and trench deeper? Or is this really an opportunity for some kind of pretty massive transformation? And I think that politically, I agree with you, Mark, about the 2020 elections. I also think that, not to get too wonky, but I think the infrastructure bill that we have on the table right now is, a historic opportunity. It's, unlike anything that's happened in recent decades. I think it would be the biggest investment in our economy since World War II. Has the potential to be the biggest investment in clean energy and transportation ever in US history. And whether it's going to move forward or not, whether it's going to put us on a fast track to 100% renewable energy, millions of new jobs, centering environmental justice, all of these great building blocks that are there, whether we're going to have a just green recovery has a lot to do with what happens with Congress in these coming weeks, really.
Mark,
Yeah.
I just wanted to maybe use that as a lead into talking about solutions, because your book doesn't. I don't want people to get this idea that they're going to read your book and jump out of a window. I mean, you do talk about solutions towards the end, and there were some really, and one of them is this issue keeps coming up. It comes up in the chat in our discussion that the 40% of people who can eat healthy food, or the 100% who could eat 40% healthy food, however that works out, is because we could afford it, and the communities of color, poor people, low-income people cannot afford fresh, healthy food. That seems to be a truism. Is it true that we've priced healthy food out of the reach of most people?
Not only, look, again, there's only so much of it to go around. So you need time, you need money, you need energy, you need equipment, you need a bunch of things to take advantage of the fact that there is some good food around to be had, but there's not enough for everyone. I think the way to move forward is the great thing about this conversation is that we're talking about two and many more concurrent crises, and they all have similar solutions, and the similar solutions are better policy. So Jenny's bringing up of the infrastructure bill is exactly the right thing. We're at this moment where the pandemic showed us many of the weaknesses of, let's say, the industrial capitalist society. It showed us that government actually has the power to help people, and pretty quickly to help people and to do things better. It shows that leadership often comes and will increasingly come from the people who have been disempowered over the years, from women, people of color, indigenous people, African Americans. And it shows that the election mattered, and that we have to take electoral politics very, very seriously, like right now. Because I think Jenny's right. I think we have a 6-month window in which to get good stuff done and to demonstrate to people who were understandably skeptical about the functionings of society that things can actually get better with good leadership and good representation. And if we can do that, then there's a chance that things continue to move in the right direction. But there's an equally good chance, or there's also a chance that we just return to the status quo as we did after the 2008 financial crisis, which was, another opportunity to change the direction of the future, and one that we didn't take advantage of, or we were shut out of.
I want to ask you this question. Part of me thinks, yeah, COVID has opened up these possibilities, but look what had to happen. We literally had to have a once in 100-year, close down the world pandemic for these things to change. And we can't really, are you saying we have to wait till the worst effects of climate change come for us to actually do something? But what I wanted to ask was, what's the balance? Because there are a lot of questions, and I think people struggle with this, between the personal and the policy, between the personal and the political. Does it matter the food choices I make, or does it not matter? What matters is me lobbying Congress to get the infrastructure bill passed, and then going out and having a 72-ounce T-bone.
No, both, absolutely both.
Okay, no, but I think that's an important point to make, right?
Yeah. But as I said, if you talk to well-heeled, well-educated audiences, it's easy to say, here's how you eat better. Everybody knows what a good diet is. So, a guilty pleasure is sort of an elite concept about what people can eat when they're allowing themselves to slide. But people with money generally know people in general know what it is to eat well. People with money can do it, and absolutely they should. Anyone who can eat well should eat well. But the political activity is important also. So it's both. There is the personal is the political, as they say, but we have to be active. Obviously, we have to take care of ourselves. But we also have to start to take care of each other in better fashion.
I was so, go ahead, Jenny.
Rob, I also think that there's between the kind of federal policy and the individual choices, there are some kind of I would almost say sort of mid-ground things that matter. We're about to enter into a clean energy industrial revolution. And that's going
Aren't
to
you
play out in
optimistic?
every local, what'd you say?
I said, aren't you optimistic?
I'm optimistic.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, we either that or we're going to perish. So, you know, there are the options. What happens in local communities, how we engage with our local city councils and our mayoral politics and our local environmental justice groups. Like there's a lot that's on the local level that's not just about, you know, our own garden and our own personal food choices, which matter, but are not going to move the needle at the speed that we need to. And so I think that, you know, sometimes people feel, I think, intimidated or turned off, or, you know, it just feels too, I think there's massive change that needs to happen on that level. And that's not the only platform in which change is going to happen. So I think you know, local community engagement on a political collective level. This is about building collective power for change.
Mark, you had some nice examples of that. I think your wife is involved in something that just struck me as or your partner is something very impressive about supplying low-income people with food, with vouchers for farmers markets, which seems like, Jenny, when you're talking about the one, you know, the level above our own garden, our own sourdough bread, eating a lot of kale, it's like getting involved in that, and below policy, it's those kinds of local initiatives.
I mean, I don't mean to imply that we should all be working on the national level. I'm sorry if I did. I do.
No. I'm just trying to tell people about
I do think that there's good work for all of us to do, and it can be hyper local, and it can be more national, and on every level in every walk of life, there are ways we can address all of the issues that we're talking about. As I said before, we're talking specifically about climate change and specifically about what I would call the food crisis, but you can't talk about those things without talking about income inequality and racism and land ownership and all the other huge issues that confront us now. So whatever thread you want to pull on, we're all trying to unravel the same knot, I think.
And that's really because, I mean, but it's also because, as you say, food is just tied to everything. I mean, we wake up, we eat, and all the choices that come from that, all the things it leads to, it's just intimately tied in. Well, I see that our time is limited. I want to tell people that they could find out so much more about these things. They could hear Mark almost in real time if they subscribe to his newsletter. I think it's called the Bittman Project. Is that?
Yes.
Yes. You weren't sure what your newsletter was called.
I was reading.
That wasn't a trick question. Anyway, I really recommend you subscribe to the Bittman Project. It's excellent. Join Dayenu. They're doing great work. I want to thank Dayenu and the Forward for sponsoring this, for working with us on it. Mark, I really want to thank you for your book and for joining us today. This was a great conversation. And I'm so glad I was here to witness you getting your absolution and your Jewishness from a rabbi. That was profound. Maybe the last question is, how has what you know now, Mark, after having researched this book, I mean, you knew a lot of this stuff before, but how has it changed you personally, changed your habits personally, changed how you live in this world personally? And Jenny, I'm going to ask you the same question.
It's allowed me to spend 6 hours a day on Zoom calls.
You
would have done that. We all do that anyway.
I don't know. I think I'm more thoughtful. I think I'm more introspective, actually. And I think maybe I'm able to see the bigger picture a little better. I don't know. It's just a process. I'm just growing up. That's all. I mean, the book was part of it, but it wasn't a radical change for me. It hasn't been a radical change for me. Yeah, I think I'm just growing up.
Thanks. Jenny?
I think after 25 years of working on sort of people social justice issues, realizing that the climate crisis is the existential crisis of our time, upon which all else rests, and that it is a social, economic, and racial justice issue. And so had not imagined in my early 50s to be starting a new organization, but took the plunge feeling like we need to bring the full power and people of the Jewish community to this moment. And Dayenu has the double entendre of we've had enough climate destruction, and Dayenu, we have enough. We have what we need, the technology, the science, the people, so that everyone can have enough. And that's our work to do collectively.
Well, Dayenu, as they say. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everybody who's joined us. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.